William Shakespeare. Part 3. Influence, critical reputation, authorship, religion, sexuality, and portraiture. Shakespeare's influence. Shakespeare's work has made a significant and lasting impression on later theater and literature. In particular, he expanded the dramatic potential of characterization, plot, language, and genre. Until Romeo and Juliet, for example, romance had not been viewed as a worthy topic for tragedy. Soliloquies had been used mainly to convey information about characters or events, but Shakespeare used them to explore characters' minds. His work heavily influenced later poetry. The Romantic poets attempted to revive Shakespearean verse drama, though with little success. Critic George Steiner described all English verse dramas from Coleridge to Tennyson as feeble variations on Shakespearean themes. John Milton, considered by many to be the most important English poet after Shakespeare, wrote in tribute, "Thou in our wonder and astonishment hast built thyself a livelong monument." Shakespeare influenced novelists such as Thomas Hardy, William Faulkner, and Charles Dickens. The American novelist Herman Melville's soliloquies owe much to Shakespeare. His Captain Ahab in Moby Dick is a classic tragic hero, inspired by King Lear. Scholars have identified 20,000 pieces of music linked to Shakespeare's works, including Felix Mendelssohn's Overture and incidental music for A Midsummer Night's Dream and Sergei Prokofiev's ballet Romeo and Juliet. His work has inspired several operas, among them Giuseppe Verdi's Macbeth, Othello, and Falstaff, whose critical standing compares with that of the source plays. Shakespeare has also inspired many painters, including the Romantics and the Pre-Raphaelites. While William Hogarth's 1745 painting of actor David Garrick playing Richard III was decisive in establishing the genre of theatrical portraiture in Britain, the Swiss Romantic artist Henry Fuseli, a friend of William Blake, even translated Macbeth into German. The psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud drew on Shakespearean psychology, in particular that of Hamlet, for his theories of human nature. Shakespeare has been a rich source for filmmakers. Akira Kurosawa adapted Macbeth and King Lear as Throne of Blood and Ran, respectively. Other examples of Shakespeare on film include Max Reinhardt's A Midsummer Night's Dream, Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, and Al Pacino's documentary Looking for Richard. Orson Welles, a lifelong lover of Shakespeare, directed and starred in films of Macbeth and Othello, and Chimes at Midnight, in which he plays John Falstaff, which Welles himself called his best work. In Shakespeare's day, English grammar, spelling, and pronunciation were less standardized than they are now, and his use of language helped shape modern English. Samuel Johnson quoted him more often than any other author in his A Dictionary of the English Language, the first serious work of its type. Expressions such as "with bated breath, Merchant of Venice," and "a foregone conclusion, Othello," have found their way into everyday English speech. Shakespeare's influence extends far beyond his native England and the English language. His reception in Germany was particularly significant. As early as the 18th century, Shakespeare was widely translated and popularized in Germany, and gradually became a classic of the German Weimar era. Christoph Martin Wieland was the first to produce complete translations of Shakespeare's plays in any language. Actor and theater director Simon Callow writes, "This master, this titan, this genius, so profoundly British and so effortlessly universal, each different culture, German, Italian, Russian, was obliged to respond to the Shakespearean example. For the most part, they embraced it, and him, with joyous abandon, as the possibilities of language and character in action that he celebrated liberated writers across the continent." Some of the most deeply affecting productions of Shakespeare have been non-English and non-European. He is that unique writer. He has something for everyone. According to Guinness World Records, Shakespeare remains the world's best-selling playwright, with sales of his plays and poetry believed to have achieved in excess of 4 billion copies in the almost 400 years since his death. He is also the third most translated author in history. Reputation of William Shakespeare and timeline of Shakespeare criticism. He was not of an age, but for all time. Ben Jonson. Shakespeare was not revered in his lifetime, but he received a large amount of praise. In 1598, the cleric and author Francis Mears singled him out from a group of English playwrights as the most excellent in both comedy and tragedy. The authors of the Parnassus plays at St. John's College, Cambridge, numbered him with Chaucer, Gower, and Spenser. In the first folio, Ben Jonson called Shakespeare the soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage, although he had remarked elsewhere that Shakespeare wanted art, lacked skill. Between the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 and the end of the 17th century, classical ideas were in vogue. As a result, critics of the time mostly rated Shakespeare below John Fletcher and Ben Jonson. Thomas Rymer, for example, condemned Shakespeare for mixing the comic with the tragic. Nevertheless, poet and critic John Dryden rated Shakespeare highly, saying of Jonson, "I admire him, but I love Shakespeare." He also famously remarked that Shakespeare was naturally learned. He needed not the spectacles of books to read nature. He looked inwards and found her there. For several decades, Rymer's view held sway. But during the 18th century, critics began to respond to Shakespeare on his own terms and, like Dryden, to acclaim what they termed his natural genius. A series of scholarly editions of his work, notably those of Samuel Johnson in 1765 and Edmund Malone in 1790, added to his growing reputation. By 1800, he was firmly enshrined as the national poet and described as the Bard of Avon, or simply the Bard. In the 18th and 19th centuries, his reputation also spread abroad. Among those who championed him were the writers Voltaire, Goethe, Stendhal, and Victor Hugo. During the Romantic era, Shakespeare was praised by the poet and literary philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and the critic August Wilhelm Schlegel translated his plays in the spirit of German Romanticism. In the 19th century, critical admiration for Shakespeare's genius often bordered on adulation. "This King Shakespeare," the essayist Thomas Carlyle wrote in 1840, "does not he shine, in crowned sovereignty, over us all, as the noblest, gentlest, yet strongest of rallying signs, indestructible." The Victorians produced his plays as lavish spectacles on a grand scale. The playwright and critic George Bernard Shaw mocked the cult of Shakespeare worship as bardolatry, claiming that the new naturalism of Ibsen's plays had made Shakespeare obsolete. The modernist revolution in the arts during the early 20th century, far from discarding Shakespeare, eagerly enlisted his work in the service of the avant-garde. The Expressionists in Germany and the Futurists in Moscow mounted productions of his plays. Marxist playwright and director Bertolt Brecht devised an epic theater under the influence of Shakespeare. The poet and critic T.S. Eliot argued against Shaw that Shakespeare's primitiveness, in fact, made him truly modern. Eliot, along with G. Wilson Knight and the School of New Criticism, led a movement towards a closer reading of Shakespeare's imagery. In the 1950s, a wave of new critical approaches replaced modernism and paved the way for postmodern studies of Shakespeare. By the 1980s, Shakespeare studies were open to movements such as structuralism, feminism, new historicism, African American studies, and queer studies. Comparing Shakespeare's accomplishments to those of leading figures in philosophy and theology, Harold Bloom wrote, "Shakespeare was larger than Plato and then St. Augustine. He encloses us because we see with his fundamental perceptions." Shakespeare authorship question. Around 230 years after Shakespeare's death, doubts began to be expressed about the authorship of the works attributed to him. Proposed alternative candidates include Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Several group theories have also been proposed. All but a few Shakespeare scholars and literary historians consider it a fringe theory, with only a small minority of academics who believe that there is reason to question the traditional attribution, but interest in the subject. Particularly the Oxfordian theory of Shakespeare authorship continues into the 21st century. Religious views of William Shakespeare. Shakespeare conformed to the official state religion, but his private views on religion have been the subject of debate. Shakespeare's will uses a Protestant formula, and he was a confirmed member of the Church of England, where he was married, his children were baptized, and where he is buried. Some scholars claim that members of Shakespeare's family were Catholics at a time when practicing Catholicism in England was against the law. Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, certainly came from a pious Catholic family. The strongest evidence might be a Catholic statement of faith signed by his father, John Shakespeare, found in 1757 in the rafters of his former house in Henley Street. However, the document is now lost and scholars differ as to its authenticity. In 1591, the authorities reported that John Shakespeare had missed church for fear of process for debt, a common Catholic excuse. In 1606, the name of William's daughter Susanna appears on a list of those who failed to attend Easter communion in Stratford. Other authors argue that there is a lack of evidence about Shakespeare's religious beliefs. Scholars find evidence both for and against Shakespeare's Catholicism, Protestantism, or lack of belief in his plays, but the truth may be impossible to prove. Sexuality of William Shakespeare. Few details of Shakespeare's sexuality are known. At 18, he married 26-year-old Anne Hathaway, who was pregnant. Susanna, the first of their 3 children, was born 6 months later on May 26, 1583. Over the centuries, some readers have posited that Shakespeare's sonnets are autobiographical and point to them as evidence of his love for a young man. Others read the same passages as the expression of intense friendship rather than romantic love. The 26 so-called Dark Lady sonnets addressed to a married woman are taken as evidence of heterosexual liaisons. Portraits of Shakespeare. No written contemporary description of Shakespeare's physical appearance survives, and no evidence suggests that he ever commissioned a portrait, so the Droeshout engraving, which Ben Jonson approved of as a good likeness, and his Stratford monument provide perhaps the best evidence of his appearance. From the 18th century, the desire for authentic Shakespeare portraits fueled claims that various surviving pictures depicted Shakespeare. That demand also led to the production of several fake portraits, as well as misattributions, repaintings, and relabeling of portraits of other people. References. From Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia, accessed February 19, 2024.